history archivist. So today's book talk on oral history in the environment is sponsored by our publications committee. Our part of our charge as a committee this year is to spotlight publications that feature themes of the upcoming conference in Portland. And so that's what we're doing today. This is the first book talk. We're hoping to do another one in late summer, potentially. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jason in a second, and he's going to facilitate all this. But the housekeeping notes that I want to mention is I'll put in a minute in the chat. We are compiling a reading list for folks who are interested in this oral history and the environment topic, but don't know where to start. It will go along with the conference. We'll send it out about a month or so in advance. So in the chat, I'm going to put a link to a Google form if you've got a work that you feel was incredibly helpful, whether it's an introductory work or a deep cut or any range of topics within that, send it our way, and we might use it in the reading list that we're compiling now. And then so we're going to try to go 45 minutes to an hour of talking and then open it up to Q&A. And so you can use the Q&A function. You can also chat along as you want as we're going. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jason Higgins now, fellow committee member. I'm going to turn off my mic and my video. So take it away.
Welcome, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce two scholars who were really influential in my own thinking, especially about oral history, best practices, and trauma. Stephen M. Sloan is a professor of history and director of the Institute for Oral History at Baylor University. He currently serves as executive director of the Oral History Association. He is a co-author and co-editor of recent works, including Oral History at a Distance and Oral History in the Environment, Global Perspectives on Climate, Connection, and Catastrophe. And in 2024, he was named both Baylor's Cornelia Marshall Smith Professor of the Year and a Big 12 Faculty of the Year, while his institute received the Governor's Award for Historic Preservation. Mark Cave is senior historian with the Historic New Orleans Collection and is currently the vice president-elect of the Oral History Association. He is past president of the International Oral History Association and has worked on several book projects with Stephen Sloan. And that actually leads into my first question. So you've also co-edited Listening on the Edge, a co-edited volume which explores oral history in the aftermath of crisis. And it provides best practices and advice for encountering trauma and doing oral history in the midst of disaster. Could you just give us a little bit of background about your partnership and how did that form?
Well, we've known each other for a long time, and came up with the idea for Listening on the Edge, and was looking for somebody to collaborate with, and then Stephen was the perfect person to do that. We had a really good working relationship, and we had won the 2015 Oral History Book Award. So I think we were both very pleased with ourselves, and so we thought we would take advantage of that and try to get another book published together. And so that's how the environment book got started. Stephen, did you want to say more?
Yeah, I will say, just as a note, chat should be enabled now. I think there was a problem there where chat was not enabled for a minute. But yeah, Mark is the nicest person on the planet. And so if you ever get an opportunity, as I've said before, do something with Mark Cave. So he's great to work with, and I've worked with him on several different projects. I was at the University of Southern Mississippi at the time doing work on Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi, and Mark was at the Historic New Orleans Collection doing work on Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And so it seemed like a great partnership. And again, we enjoyed the first book so much we did it again.
So what inspired you to pivot slightly toward oral history and the environment? Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think that was Stephen's idea, wanted to do something on the environment. From my part, I kind of saw it as, in a way, a continuation of our crisis work, in that we're dealing with one big, giant global crisis with many different facets and ways to look at it. So I saw it as a kind of a continuation of our crisis work, but Stephen came up with the idea and approached me about it. So.
Yeah, so I've always taught environmental history. It's one of the things I teach as a professor of history here, and always felt a bit of a disconnect between what I saw in environmental history work and oral history work. And there's this bit of a turn, I talk about it in my introduction, bit of a turn in environmental history in the late 1990s. We call it the human turn, environmental history, where you're bringing kind of the human experience back into the story of environmental history, which had kind of been, um, not the focus early on in the environmental movement. It was about giving voice to other elements in historic narratives. And so, but I still saw this disconnect, but I had seen emergent work. And of course, as Mark said, we had some of this in Listening on the Edge, dealing with environmental issues. Mark was working, saw Mark do a great presentation. That's a chapter in the book on pelican cleanup after the hurricane, after the BP oil spill in the Gulf, and different folks that I knew around the globe that were really doing groundbreaking work with oral history to try to understand environmental issues. And of course, that's of all stripes, right? I mean, environmental disaster is in here, but we also found folks that are working on kind of the breadth of research that can be done on environmental issues.
Thank you for that. And I'm definitely curious about the process by which you identify contributors to the volume, but hopefully our conversation can be natural. And of course, as an oral historian, I have too many questions prepared, and I'll probably put them aside at some point. But for those in the audience who haven't yet read this book, could you provide a brief synopsis of it?
Yeah, the book is, in fact, I need to remember how many chapters. I think it's 12 chapters with different practitioners. All of these, except the case of one, are the interviewer and the author are the same. In other words, we really wanted to foreground this double helix format, as we began to call it, of foregrounding narratives. So about a 3,000 word excerpt or excerpts of oral histories that were done. Really wanted to foreground the voices of the people that the narrators that were working with our investigators. And then about a 5,000 word critical analysis piece of that work, not only talking about the findings from doing that work, but just the process of using oral history to do this sort of work and the special qualities oral history had to do this sort of research. And so the book really covers, it's very multidisciplinary. It's a host of different disciplines, and there are interviews with environmental activists, but I wouldn't say that that's the focus of the book, just environmental activists. It's really the broad range of kind of people's experience with environments. And it deals with, of course, topics like wilderness, topics like climate change, but also things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, like rural water systems or, different aspects of kind of environmental change and the ways in which researchers were encountering it globally. We wanted to look broadly outside the American context to engage practitioners. Mark's been very involved in the International Oral History Association, so he had networks there. But we wanted to learn from people all around the globe on what sort of work they were doing.
And Stephen's introduction, I think, is really wonderful, provides a real good background in the history of oral history in environmental research. I think is It's really good. And then Christopher Sellers wrote kind of an ending chapter, an epilogue, which really kind of went into the thoughts that the contributors had in their essays and kind of compiled them and put them in context within the larger field of environmental history, I think. So,
Thank you for that. So we have a couple of good starting places to read. Um, so thinking from a broad perspective, um, what have oral histories revealed about how the relationship between humans and the environment has changed over time in living memory? And I was really curious after reading the introduction if you could talk a little bit more about maybe what you see as the most significant changes and what oral history has revealed about them.
Yeah, I think for me is just the expertise. We knew this as oral historians, right? The expertise that our narrators hold, and guess what? They hold great expertise about the environments that they encounter and they live in, and so indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, just the ways in which these stories can help us understand, in some cases, extremely large and very abstract phenomena that in the past has been the subject of, I would say, much more detached scientific study. But again, we know as oral historians, a way to make it intimate, a way to make it authentic, is to hear the stories of people, oftentimes that are talking about either their response to crisis sort of situations in environmental terms, or they're talking about slow change that they've seen in relationships with environments. I mean, we have reindeer herders in here. We have I wrote down at one point just all the different people that were included in the book. Farmers, wildlife rescue operators, volunteers, activists, elders, water system managers, indigenous voices, wilderness rangers, reindeer herders, fishers, foresters, just that variety of ways in which we know oral history can bring unexpected perspectives to understand environmental issues. And so I think the ways in which it expands authority, brings in new voices, it was an opportunity to do that in terms of understanding environments as well.
in my chapter, which was devoted to wildlife rescue following the oil spill, I wanted to get at why people responded, like what motivated them to respond. And I found it really interesting in the life stories of people, like what was it in their life story that formed this empathy for other creatures in the world. And I think getting at that can tell us a lot about our relationship to nature and how to improve it. And there was one really wonderful interview I did with a volunteer. He was an animal rights volunteer that went down there. And he was divorced, was, in New Orleans during Katrina, and he was with his two cats, and he was able to rescue his two cats as his house was flooding. He threw them in a suitcase and climbed up a ladder and spent the rest of the storm on the roof with his two cats. And then they went with him when he left town, came back, and they lived together in a little trailer as he rebuilt his house. But in his life story, he credited that experience with creating this empathy for other creatures and noted that as one of the reasons why he wanted to help the birds after the oil spill. But there's all sorts of ways that life stories can tell us why our why we have a particular relationship with nature, I think.
Thank you for that answer. I'm jotting down follow-up questions. I'm going to have to like pick and choose selectively. The cool thing about virtual interviews is no one can see me writing down my questions. Um, so the chapters include scholars from around the world, which you've already kind of stated, they work in a variety of disciplines. It's a very transdisciplinary, transnational approach. But taken together cumulatively, what do their insights reveal as a whole about oral history and the environment? In other words, what do you see as the collective significance of this book?
Yeah, I think that the personal narrative makes the subject more approachable to people. It's more emotional. People can trust it. And I think as Chris Chambers kind of brought that out in his epilogue, that there's a lot of people that distrust science. But to hear an account by somebody like them talking about changes in the environment and what's going on um, is more effective in some ways, I think.
Yeah, I'm a bit distracted because I'm trying to get chat enabled for everyone. I'm also managing the webinar at the same time that I'm participating in the webinar. So sorry about that. Sorry that you don't have chat enabled yet, but you will soon. So yeah, I think it was just an opportunity for me. I saw it as an opportunity to learn just in doing a book like this. And I learned a lot like I did and listening on the edge when Mark and I did that book. And I see the book as very much as suggestive of the great work that could be done. And my hope was it was a call to both environmental historians and oral historians to engage these sorts of issues. Extremely timely research. I mean, this is the moment that we live in where we need a deeper understanding and we need a deeper public appreciation and understanding for some of the issues that we face. And I don't know that we're going to get there by more data. I think we're going to get there by different looks and different understandings of it. And I think oral history is one of those tools that's going to get us there.
Wow. Um, I speak from a little bit of experience, having, my first book was a co-edited collection. And I think that they're really powerful in the ways that they can help shape a field or the future directions of a field as a call to action, as you've put it. With that said, were there any surprising challenges in co-editing either book in your experience?
I think with this book, we really wanted it to be global. So finding really good chapters in parts of the world um, that we weren't as familiar with um, was really important. I think, cultures are so different and the way they frame their experience is different. And we wanted to kind of represent that. I think um, people, like particularly indigenous people, have a different notion of time. And I think we wanted to get that across. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I've said this several times before. So if you've been in the room when I've said this, I'm sorry. But I say every oral history association gathering, there's one question that is, what is oral history? And so that sort of how do we define our practice? How do we refine our practice? That is different in different places of the world, and they have different understandings of what this is. There's not right or wrong understandings in different kind of cultural contexts, but there's ways in which we can learn from each other and continue to rethink our own approaches. But that does present a challenge when you want to do a book like this. Kind of coming up with some kind of common ground that we can stand on and learn from each other. And so that was probably the biggest challenge in doing this. What I've, and of course, you're limited by how many pages Oxford will give us. I mean, there's such great work going on around the globe. Um, you know, Even in Listening on the Edge, we could have three more volumes of great crisis work that's going on. And so you're limited by what can go in, but there's such an inspiring work going on right now.
With that said, I'm just curious, having done a multitude of oral history interviews and edited the contributions of other scholars, what stories resonated with you the most from the people being interviewed?
I thought Deb Anderson's work on drought in Australia was really interesting, and her multiple interviews over time with people, and how they used humor as a way to kind of deal with these difficult times, and also how some of them had the slow realization that climate change was something that was real in a part of the world where a lot of people doubted that. So I thought that was a really interesting one. I love the account of the reindeer herder in Taro's article and chapter. I think he was a real interesting person, and just people that I never thought of before, and I never imagined the life of a reindeer herder and how things might impact their lives. So that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, one more I'll mention was Javier Arce Nazario's uh, chapter on rural water systems in Puerto Rico. Uh, the community members that talked about what these water systems meant to them, just the status of being a maintainer of the water systems, and the conflict with the push toward modernization, towards better environmental practices to hook these into a much more modern system. And of course, some of these rural water systems that never had failures in decades had failures immediately in these new, modern, better water systems. And so, just the layers at which that story talked about community identity, talked about community belonging. There's the tensions between, standard environmental practice and they thought they were doing a favor for these rural water systems to bring in uh, cleaner water that would have less bacteria in it and things like that. But the way in which that undermined on some level kind of the independence and pride of some of these rural communities. And so I found that to be a really fascinating piece.
Which is going through an old National Geographic not too long ago, and it made me think of Sarupa's article, but it was a giant hand with a test tube, and there was an Indian farmer underneath it, and it said Union Carbide helps build a better India or something like that. And then I was, thinking about her chapter and what the people have been going through and are still going through. And when we were doing the book, she towards the end of it, she let us know that some of her people involved in the project had died of COVID. I don't know if it was a result of their ongoing problems as a result of that, but we devoted or dedicated part of the book to some of them.
Yeah, I think that that's both the blessing of doing oral history and one of the hardships is that if you've started more than even in my own life, like 15 years ago, some of the earliest people I interviewed have passed on, but it's an incredible honor whenever a family member might reach out to you after having watched one of the interviews or even shared it during a ceremony celebrating their life. And I think that that's an incredible value of oral history. So thanks for saying that. Um, are there topics or perspectives that you wish had been included or that you sought to include that you weren't able to in hindsight?
I was thinking about that, and I think the only thing I could think, I think we did a good job, but it's all very human centric. That it's all from the point of view of human beings, and I just wish there was a way that other life could share their stories in some way. That's not possible, but I think understanding our impact on other life forms, I think, is central to our relationship to nature. And I wish there was some way to go beyond the human um, narrative.
I'll let Stephen respond as well, and then I can read the question from the chat and let you both address that one.
Mhm. Yeah, Mark's comment there. Mark's chapter is also great, talking about bird cleanup, pelican cleanup primarily after the bee poo oil spill. He explores some of the things he's talking about and what his suggestion was there. I think there were some areas of the world we really want to get into, and we couldn't just make a connection there. I also think, a lot of the people that we worked with are having a little bit of more traditional outcomes with oral history work and that they're publishing and things like that. And so I think I would have liked to have seen, and perhaps in the future, artists or other performers or people that are using oral history to inform kind of other outcomes besides publishing outcomes and standard research outcomes.
Fantastic. Thank you. This question is from Kevin McCaffrey. He agrees with Steve relating oral history to the larger topic of environment. I suspect that this will emerge in new ways of seeing the subtopics within, much like what happened to defining food waves. Environmental challenges are moving faster and faster these days as we understand them. What kind of solutions do you offer, and how does your book reveal these new topics, do you think?
I think the solution just lies in um, understanding um, in our own lives what um, creates an empathy toward nature. Like, um, what is in it in our childhood, whether, we had trips to the national parks as a child with your father, just walks in the woods. There was a veterinarian that I interviewed that was really interested in building model birds, and she wanted to be an ornithologist, but ended up as a veterinarian. But what in our life experience leads us to have a deeper empathy towards nature, I think.
Yeah, I would take, you could take one aspect of work that's in the book that's talking about climate change. I mean, you talk about something that is complex and often a very overwhelming issue. How do you crystallize it into something that we can begin to understand and connect with as a human issue? Oral history is made for that. It reveals social and economic inequalities of climate change, mental health and trauma, all these layers of what climate change means for certain communities, the uneven impact of climate change. You know, some of these issues are just so complex. I really feel like oral history has the ability to put some texture on them and to humanize them and to make them accessible in a lot of ways. And again, solutions, I'm hoping, if it can affect change, it can affect change in policy. It can affect change in decision makers on this. And so I truly believe it's the human story in here that is so important in affecting change.
If I may, I'd like to ask a follow-up to that question and just acknowledge how difficult it can be to do crisis-related work, particularly in a time whenever forces are actively hostile to the work that we do. And I'm just curious what keeps you going, or what do you find most inspiring about the stories that you're elevating?
I've been, well, we've been trying to tackle the climate change issue at work. I know Kevin McCaffrey, who's on the chat, has done a lot of work, but been finding it hard to get started. It's like such a big crisis, and we know it's impacting our lives, but it's moving really slowly. And it's a crisis, but it's not like a hurricane where you have one defined moment that impacts people's lives and then you deal with it. It's something that's happening. People, um, lose insurance on their houses, or there's a fire, they have a decision to rebuild or not. So it's a long, slow crisis. And how to document that, I think, is a real challenge.
How do you do self-care in these long processes then? If the work is sometimes years or decades long, like how do you practice self-care?
But I think the first step is acknowledging that you need to practice self-care, and that's something that often we ignore. And I feel like, I mean, it's really been the last 10 years, 15 years that I feel like there's been a vibrant conversation in our community about that issue of self-care. But it is real. You need to be prepared if you're dealing with topics like this. You need to have a strategy for how you're going to process, how you're going to have balance in your life. Whether it be journaling or networks of support or things like that. It's varying your work is really important as well. There are other fields we can learn from, like psychology, where they've thought about vicarious trauma, they've thought about you know, uh, compassion fatigue, they've thought about a lot of the things that we're dealing with for a long time. And I think learning from other disciplines is important as well.
Thank you for that. Linda Shopes says you are both right, of course, about the value of oral history and humanizing environmental issues, touching people in ways that science cannot. Do you have any evidence that your book or any of the interviews or projects detailed within it have had that effect?
So I think it would be for us, it would be probably, I mean, the longer people who have sat in this space are a lot of our contributors that did chapters. And I think Soropa's work has been really important among Bhopal survivors for those in power to really understand what long disaster means in the lives of some of these individuals. I think Taro's work with the Snow Change Institute has gotten into these spaces where they're paid attention to by policymakers, and they've had a real impact. So is it universally true? No, it's not universally true. But I think there are encouraging cases where I think it's made an impact. Mark, you may have others.
I think maybe Karen Fox's work with the Mari and the geothermal fields, and the work with the elders of that community with the power company, and how they were able to use their indigenous stories and sort of reconcile between the two. I think that's story in action in some way. Um,
And the audience members should please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to translate them. Um, One of the reasons for this talk is to um, generate some excitement for the next Oral History Association meeting on the topic of landscapes of memory. And I'm curious, what do you think attendees will find most useful about your book related to that conference theme?
I think Stephen's introduction, I think, would be a really great thing for people to read. It really gives you a background on how oral history and the environment has developed over the years. I found it really interesting where he talks about the activist roots of both oral history and environmental history. Um, so I think the introduction would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Jason, that's a good question. So we've had a record number of submissions for participating in the Portland conference, and so that for me is a affirmation of in our community that this is something that is important. This is work that people are engaging with, and they're thinking in these terms. And so I think it's going to be a really exciting conference, really engaging conference. Mark is involved in kind of planning the program. Molly Graham is in the room as well, who's the co-chair of the program committee. And they're putting together a great program. I think it'll be really engaging. I would encourage folks to come.
I think it's really going to be an exciting conference. We've got so many wonderful proposals, and it's such a beautiful place to have a conference, I think.
I regret not submitting anything, but hopefully I'll find an opportunity to go anyway.
Well, if you are on the call and you have not, the poster proposals is open right now, so you can propose a poster to go to Portland.
Shout out poster proposals. Kevin adds other examples from other disciplines regarding self-care and even with your subject. I heard the social psychologists talk about this term solastalgia. In other words, nostalgia and wistfulness for a place while you're living in it. Very interesting. Thank you for that, Kevin. I'm going to look into that. Um, so, thinking about younger people, especially emergent oral historians, students, others generally invested in the future of the field of oral history or environmental studies more broadly, what are some future directions that you would like to see take shape or new areas for emergent scholarship that you think that some amazing student should take up?
I am a big believer. If you're a student out there and you're searching for a dissertation topic, and you're an oral historian and also interested in environmental history issues or in studying the environment, I'm a big believer of digging deep in one place and just the layers in which you can understand. Of course, we can think of that in environmental terms if we're doing a case study on a particular area, but we can also think of that as an oral historian working in depth with a narrator to try to understand phenomenon. And so I love case studies. I think there's so much that they can reveal and so much they can speak to toward broader issues. And so I'm looking forward to reading some of those works that really, of course, tell us a lot about a place and tell us a lot about phenomenon, but just speak to broader significance and broader conclusions and help us understand both our methodology better and elements of the environment better.
think I agree with that. Just focus on where you're at, the environment you live in, find stories there.
I love that. I often tell students or even people in general, like, look to your community. Don't look to historical scholarship or the literature to find your gap. Look around the world. And I mean, that's why oral history as a methodology is so powerful, in my view. Um, Jenny Crockett Holm, right, asks, what's the best way to find out about current environmental oral history projects? Is there a single location where they've been compiled, or do you have any kind of advice for that?
I'd say come to the conference in Portland. You'd see all the best work. Um, but yeah, I think that would be, and there's several other good books. The Land Speaks is a wonderful book that was published not too long ago, and Telling Environmental Stories is a book from Australia, which is very good. So there's some other anthologies out there that kind of talk about the work of oral history and the environment.
I just realized that we have two chat functions, the webinar and the Q&A. Anna Oleneko, apologies if I butcher your name. I'm originally from Arkansas. We don't pronounce anything correctly. How do you approach oral history projects that engage with unfinished history? For instance, many current projects use oral history methods to study human animal relations during Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine.
Hmm. I know. It'd be fascinating. I'd love to know about the cats in Ukraine and everything. So, yeah.
If I could just shout out my co-editor for my first book, John M. Kinder, who does disability scholarship and veterans. He just wrote a new book on zoos in the Second World War, and he's really interested in non-human relationships and moments of crisis. So he doesn't use oral history, unfortunately. I keep trying to convince him that it's the way, but yeah. Stephen, do you have
Yeah, I might push back a little bit and challenge the notion of there being a finished history. So just that idea of, even these things, we're always working within living memory, right? We're always understand that we think we're talking about the 1950s, and we realize that this story is not done in the lives of our interviewees. But I would encourage you, Anna. I mean, I think stepping into that space as an oral historian is really important. And that's something even when Mark and I did our work early on, it was a little controversial, doing interviews immediately after events. And now it's not.
Yeah.
Now I think we agree that there's a value there. There's also a great value later. But there's a value then as well as oral historians thinking the way oral historians think in the immediate aftermath of events. And so I think doing that kind of work is really important. And I don't believe there's a waiting period for oral history.
I'm gonna agree with that, Stephen. Uh, there's also no such thing as a finished research project. I would argue only one that's been abandoned. Um,
Well, hopefully there's finished dissertations out there. I'll hope that happens.
we hope so. If we have the resources and the infrastructure and the support for students to finish them. And last couple of questions are really broad and they may be redundant even at this point in the conversation. So I especially would welcome additional questions from everyone. I think these are best conversational. But I'll just dive into this one. In a world of increasing reliance on artificial intelligence, considering all the potential consequences, both environmental and social. What advice would you give listeners who are encountering increased pressure to employ AI in oral history or even within their scholarship, their academia, their businesses, their personal lives, their emails?
Jason, did you write that question or did Claude write
I
this?
am deeply critical of AI. As I read it out loud, I was like, I should have edited it because it was so damn wordy. But yeah, I feel like every webinar and every conference is like the central theme is AI, right? So I felt like it was a necessary question to include.
Go ahead, Mark. I've got thoughts, but I'll let Mark
Oh,
go.
no.
Yeah.
At the end of my chapter, I concluded it with the Blade Runner, the empathy test that the investigator uses to determine whether it's a robot or a real human being. And when I wrote, I thought, oh, everyone will know that who they're interviewing is actually a human being, and kind of joked that, of course, you would know that. But my point was to try to um, figure out that we need some sort of empathy test. We need a way to find out what generates compassion and empathy in our lives. But um, I don't know. I guess it didn't work. I looking back now, it's not so easy to tell what's a robot and what's a human. So
I guess I'm an oral historian because as culture shifts and changes and new technologies emerge, I double down on oral history. Just the human part. We have the things, we have long form listening in a world that's increasingly sound bites. We're profoundly human in a world where where is humanity? we are listening in a world that's increasingly shouting from poles. Just I continue to double down on our methodology as very countercultural, but increasing in its need and its place. And so I think it's very affirming. And so I would just say to those that are listening, yeah, that the human part of oral history, of course, AI tools are going to slip into what we do, and we're not scared of technology. We're not Luddites. We're an approach that's very tight. We exist because technology, some technologies exist, but I think we got to reaffirm the human part. That's our jam. So we got to reaffirm the human part as much as we can.
I love that. I have just a couple more questions, and I always ask this one during interviews. Is there anything throughout this conversation that you wanted to talk about that I didn't think to ask, or something that you wanted to go back to?
Think of anything, covered it pretty well. Stephen, do you have any?
I don't. I mean, I think you've covered it pretty well. I think of yeah, there's I'm a professor. I can speak in 45-minute, an hour, and 15-minute increments. So I can always say more, but I think you've done a really good job kind of distilling this conversation. I'm excited for work to come in this particular area, and so I'm really looking forward to perhaps even what people in the room are going to do along these lines.
Brilliant. And just for emergent oral historians, that's a trademark signature question, right? Like you always open up that space because I think it's hubris to imagine that we can predict all of the questions that would be relevant to our conversation. Um, I'll ask my final question and then I'll give it one more go at getting the audiences to ask theirs. Otherwise, we might have an early day. What's the takeaway from your book?
Think that there's a lot of work to be done. Like, I think of it like what I said earlier, that this is the big crisis of our time. Um, and it impacts all of us everywhere in the world. Um, and that it's really important to share these stories and kind of digest what people are saying everywhere and to try to use that to make some changes in ourselves as people, but also politically and economically as well.
Right on.
Yeah, I think the takeaway from me is we can offer solutions in a lot of places that I don't think we have spoken into yet. And so, I mean, I don't know what the other areas are off the top of my head, but if I sat down and thought about them, just what are the other spaces where oral history needs to do what it does? And so, this offered one opportunity to kind of highlight some ways it's being done in a variety of different contexts on a variety of different issues. But like most oral historians, I'm always aware of who's not getting to speak and who's not being interviewed. And so yeah, so that's the takeaway from me. I think maybe like Mark is some good stuff here, but wow, there's so much that needs to be done.
I'll use that as a segue for my colleague, Alyssa. Is there any questions that you would like to ask our esteemed panelist?
Um, I just want to put a quick plug in if anybody needs a topic, kind of what we're dancing around. There's a lot of AI data centers that are having a huge impact on the environment right now, which would kind of intersect on everything. And if they're not around you, come down to West Texas. They're all around us right now. I'm going to put in the link for the reading list contributions if anybody wants to, now that we've got the chat. If you want to add that, if anybody has a project they want to promote, we're also including that in there. The only question, and it may be a good way to wrap up if we have no other questions, is what's the next Sloan Cave collaboration? What's the next volume to come?
I guess just OHA right now, and we'll figure out. Stephen,
It's Mark's turn to pick.
yeah.
So
Okay.
That is a fantastic question to wrap up with. However, Martha asks a really prescient question about the book. Did the inequality of the impacts of climate change emerge as a theme in any of the interviews, especially among folks from the global south or from people of color in the United States?
you, our book wasn't extensively focused on climate change. There are a couple of uh, pieces that definitely deal with climate change, and so I don't know that we had a big of enough sample size. I do think this is something that oral history will bring out is I think oral history will magnify the economic and social inequality that with which climate change is hitting communities and individuals. I don't know that we focused on it enough to say that we did anything in that area, but Mark might have a different opinion.
No, I think you're right. I think it's a topic of a book in itself. I think the climate change and migration and the impacts it has on the poor would be a wonderful book in itself or anthology.
And I will say there's some spectacular work happening in that area globally. So there's plenty of fodder for books on that topic because oral historians are tackling that issue.
Sounds like a call to action that the next volume should focus on climate change. I'm curious, are there any members of the audience who were contributors to this volume? If not, that's okay. I was just curious. And maybe they would like to add some other perspective. Um, Follow-up question. How did you locate the authors? Was it selective or did you issue a call for papers or contributions?
It was selective. We just learned of people's work and reached out to them. Some we had met before, we knew of their work. Um, it's always a trust if we know that they're a good contributor and that they write well. But Stephen might have some other thoughts.
Yeah, Chris Sellers, who wrote the conclusion to the book, I wanted to make sure there was someone coming at it from the other direction. He's very much an environmental historian who sometimes uses oral history. And so I definitely wanted a conclusion from someone who could talk about his primary field, which is environmental history, and him thinking about what oral history was bringing to his primary field. And so that was very identified Chris early on for that piece. But we work through networks. Again, Mark's engagement with the International Oral History Association, looking at international conference programs, looking at publications, working through oral history networks around the world to find people that are working on environmental oral history in different areas. So we knocked on a lot of doors to get our group together.
And I'll just one last shout out to the OAHA. I've found that the community is kind and caring and surprisingly small. You go to these meetings and you see the same familiar faces, and you can use those opportunities as a chance to push the boundaries of scholarship a little bit farther through a co-edited volume or a journal publication. So I just want to encourage everyone to attend if you can and to read. And Mark, Stephen, I want to thank you for the opportunity to dive more deeply into your work. I think I speak for most people whenever I say we look forward to the next co-edited volume.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful, and I'm excited to work with Stephen again as well.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Alyssa. Thanks to the OHA Publications Committee for organizing this talk. Look forward to the next one.
Yeah, so next one's to be determined, but sometime before the conference, we're hoping to have one more probably guided discussion on environmental oral history. And so that'll be in an e-blast newsletter, but some email in some capacity. So thank y'all all for coming, and we're done.